Coming up, the New York Football Giants end their 2023-2024 season on a high note, beating division rival Philadelphia Eagles in somewhat fancy fashion. But beyond that, it is Joe Schoen meeting with the media, the post-season press conference, the firings, the guys that remain, the players that could be gone. It's all here, man, and we cap it all off coming up next.
Hold on 1 second.
Yes, my friends. We're coming up here in just one moment as we continue the conversation, kicking things off around the New York Football Giants, the postseason press conference. We're going to be getting into all of that right now as we think about what it meant for this 2023-2024 season and how the New York Football Giants will continue to move forward here as we really have to now do high-level evaluations. Coaching staff changes, some low level, some higher level. We also have to look at players. Saquon Barkley, what's going to happen with him, right? We have to look at what's going to happen with Sterling Shepard. He's going to retire. That's what's going to happen with him. But everything else that comes out of this game here, it really is a weird way to finalize a season, to finalize a bad season, but then also think about it in regards to what it means going forward for what will be the third year for Brian Daboll, the third year for Joe Schoen, and how we carry things forward from here. In the meantime, though, the other thing that we want to do before we dive in just 1 second is let you know about one of our sponsors, and we'll do that here coming up in just one moment. All right. Thank you for sticking with us here as we got ourselves rolling here. You have, of course, the press conferences happening on a Monday morning with Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll and all these comments. So you want to make sure you get your ducks into a nice little pretty row. And we will, of course, dive in on this conversation here in just 1 second after we let you know that our friends over at Potential got you covered. Listen, it's all about well-being. Are you doing it right? Are you keeping yourself mentally well throughout the day, the week, the year? The New York Football Giants are going to be asking that on a lot of different levels. So when you go over to Pietential.com, Pietential, you're going to go ahead and be able to use online assessments. It's essentially a survey that sets benchmarks and tracks your well-being and gives you coaching to improve it and also tracks your progress over time. It's free for individual users, and you can check it all out at Pietential.com. All right, so the New York Football Giants do, of course, take care of business in the final game of the season. It's a massive, fun, joyous win, 27-10 over the Philadelphia Eagles. And it does cap off a season that was tumultuous. We understand that. But they did it in a big way. This is starters for the Eagles. This is a game that matters for them. It's the first half of this game that really matters for them. And we kind of got this taste with Tyrod Taylor at quarterback, with a little bit of Wan'Dale Robinson taking a massive step forward. Maybe what could have been, right? What could have been for this team along the way. Some big defensive plays, interceptions, just a lot of things to celebrate, along with Sterling Shepard as well, right? So there were some really fun moments on Sunday that if you are a New York Football Giants fan and you're willing to go beyond the idea of the draft impact, which was small, but still mattered. They go from 5 to 6 ultimately after it all shakes out. You just look back and you say, hey, this was a season that should have gone better. This is a season that's going to say goodbye to a lot of players, and we get to kind of celebrate. So hopefully that's what you were able to do, especially if you attended the game over on the comments in the live section. If you want, feel free to let us know if you were at the game. We'll also take some time on the back end to discuss what it looks like going forward and answer any questions that you guys may want to get in on. Now, moving over to the more important conversation. Joe Schoen met with the media following Sunday's game, obviously. 6-11 season, and the high-level question marks kind of down the back half of this season over the last month or so was about Wink Martindale and Mike Kafka. So we start there. They address it and say, we believe that they're going to be back. We just need to have conversations. Now, part of my problem with saying we just need to have conversations is what adjustments could you have made in season? Would it have made a difference with all the injuries that they suffered through? Probably not. But it looks like on a high level that Wink Martindale and Mike Kafka are going to be back. My anticipation here is that when we think about the New York Football Giants and we think about their offense, I expect Brian Daboll to get much more hands-on when it comes to the offensive side of the ball. It doesn't have to be a knock on Mike Kafka, but he's a guy that comes out of a situation in Kansas City. You feel like, hey, here is an opportunity for this team to bring in a young creative mind, and it doesn't quite work out. So I would anticipate that Mike Kafka is going to be here, but that Brian Daboll is going to have a much stronger influence on the offensive side of the ball. Defensively, Andy, when we think about Wink Martindale and him returning, I think the consensus becomes probably, if I've read the tea leaves correctly, hey, you do your job, I'll do my job, and that need not be, dissected any further. These guys don't have to get along in order to have a successful tandem, but it's not a guarantee that both of these coaches are going to be back. There is some potential for other opportunities. Most likely with Wink, head coaching would be the way that he goes. As I just said, Kafka, he's going to be back. There's no other elevated promotion for him to seek elsewhere. So it's going to be about him trying to kind of get his career trajectory back on track.
Yeah, Adam, it's going to be interesting because I have a little bit of a different take on what I think is going to happen. Because you hear Joe Schoen, you hear Brian Daboll talk about, we expect them to be back. And that's the answer that you give in the press conference when there's 1 year left on both of their contracts, right? Like you can't make any grandiose statements in that position right there. You're like, sure, in a vacuum, they're going to be back because they have a contract with us. What I think is going to be interesting, and we talked about this before, is it takes two to tango, Adam. And I don't know if Mike Kafka and Wink Martindale want to be back. So the question is, if they both say, this is untenable, I cannot work in this situation anymore for whatever those reasons are behind the scenes. And Wink says, listen, like, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. The Giants will likely just let them go where they want to go. You don't want someone there who doesn't want to be there, right? So this is an easy way for them to start the press conference saying, we expect them to be back, but they still they admitted they haven't talked to Kafka or Wink yet today. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens when they actually have a conversation with them.
Okay, and maybe that'll be the case. I guess my pushback on that would be that when you look at the New York Giants and you think about their coaching staffs in the past, like they still pay out money to other head coaches that they fired, right? They fired Pat Shermer, had to pay him out. They fired Joe Judge, had to pay him out. And Mike, John Mara does not like having to do that. And if you let both of these guys go, then you're going to be talking about paying multiple coordinators. Now, the interesting thing is, it was also speculated even ahead of the game yesterday that John Mara's consensus was he would not want sweeping everybody gone off the coaching staff changes in one offseason. Now, the part that I do agree with you about it is that going into the final year, you're also setting the tone of, hey, guess what? 3 weeks into the season, you know, things aren't going so well, and then it looks a little bit different. And if you're Joe Schoen, let's say, and if you're Brian Daboll and those two guys are connected at the hip, and you both, have your private discussions and say, I'd prefer to be off of Wink Martindale. Maybe I think a change for Kafka would be good. There could be a little two-man deal there where they say, okay, let's get into the season, and if it starts to go the wrong way, I can go to John Mara and say, hey, it's not working out. We're now in a new season. We need to get the right way. The downside there is, can the Giants afford to sacrifice, 2-3 weeks of a season and go, well, we're 0-3, so now we got to start letting go of coordinators. That's a whole other can of worms for this coach and GM tandem.
You're totally right. And that's my biggest concern is like, if they're both like, we don't want to really be here. And then the answer is like, well, let's just give it a couple weeks of next season. Like, right. That's the worst spot for the Giants to be. If they're only under contract for one more season and they don't want to be here and we don't think things are going to change, it's better to make the change now, have a full offseason and figure out what you want to do than it is to like try to make a broken marriage work when you know that the end is still going to be the same result at the end of next season. So I think there's still a lot more question marks, even with Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll coming out and saying, we expect them to be back. Yeah. I expect to hear more about this in the coming days.
Oh, there you go. Oh. So Andrew Makowitz sets his own expectations for what he expects on what the Giants expect to happen over the course of this offseason. Now, the other thing is here, too, there's a couple of just one quick quote that I'll give from Joe Schoen just in regard to the team and the injuries they suffered before we talk about specific players here at a high level. And then we're going to get into Thomas McGahee and we're going to get into obviously Bobby Johnson as well. But Joe Schoen said, and this is per Paul Dottino, who's giving coverage live play-by-play blows from the press conference this morning, has a lot of faith, does Joe Schoen, in the medical staff and what they do. They always seek information on how injuries happen and if it is repetitive, like injury stats show last 6 years and only 2, obviously, this season in terms of ACLs going from the recent history and then into this year. it's just a good footnote here because, again, listen, NFL is littered with injuries. We saw A.J. Brown go down yesterday for the Eagles. We saw Jalen Hurts have an injury yesterday for the Eagles. We saw Tyrod Taylor battling through injuries for the Eagles. We saw Tommy DeVito battle through injuries for everybody is dealing with injuries, yet the Giants suffer a lot of them and somewhat consistently. And if that's a part of what you feel like derailed this year, I will be curious, right? We're now going to enter year 3 of a new GM, and he made a lot of changes, did Joe Schoen, to analytics and how we approach drafting and how we approach medical, and yet some of these themes still carry over. So I just wanted to footnote that before we move into the player side of this coming out of it, which obviously comes with some high-level guys. Let's just start with the main one here. Saquon Barkley, before we get to Daniel Jones, the assessment is the same assessment that it was a year ago, right? We have options. We have the tag we can work with. Saquon Barkley said we're in no rush, but we'll obviously negotiate and have discussions. What is your temperature of what's going to happen with Saquon Barkley based on how you hear Joe Schoen address it after this season?
I think going into last season, everyone wanted everyone to be back and they wanted to find a way to make it work. It felt like the way that Saquon was talking, he's like, I don't see a world in which I'm not back here. Like I even think he secretly would have taken a significant pay cut on a longer term deal just to get a deal done. That was my sense on how much he really wanted to be here. This one does feel significantly different, right, Adam? Like, the tone, these last 6 years have been great. If this was the last of it, so be it. But he said, I'm also not retiring. Like, I'm still planning on playing football. This just might be a chapter in the whole thing. It does feel a little bit different. I am curious what the market is going to be for Saquon Barkley, because I see a world where Joe Schoen just looks and says, go out now, find the best deal you can get and just give us an opportunity to match it. Like, what does that deal look like? As an example, the Houston Texans have like $75 million in cap space. If they offered Saquon Barkley like 13, 14 million, the Giants aren't going to match that, right? Sure. And so it's a tough situation where I think Saquon knows he can get more on the open market. And this franchise tag situation, if the Giants tag him again, the second they tag him, does that mean that's the start of the end of Saquon Barkley here because he's just not going to play on the tag? Like, what's your take if the Giants end up tagging him again?
I don't think that he'll play on the tag this year. And it's somewhat counterintuitive because the 20% increase gets you to 12.5 million for him. And you can make a very strong case. You go over, look at Spot Track, you go look at over the cap, the projections for where free agency is going to be for not just Saquon Barkley, but the running back class in general. It's not big. The numbers are not big. A guy like Derrick Henry, who addressed the fans, for the Tennessee Titans after the game on the field, he had another 1,000-yard season. He is 30 years old. He's ready to be worth less than $7 million on the open market. So there's the world where if you're Saquon, you look at it and you go, I can't play on the tag again. But the 12.5 million might equal nearly what you're going to earn over 2 years on another contract with another team. But I think this comes down to perception. So to your point about if he goes to market, we'll talk about this more in the offseason, but just my footnote here is if he goes to market and the value is $8 million a year, let's just say, I think that it will feel different to take the quote undervalued contract from the franchise that drafted you and that you want to spend your whole career with than it is to say, okay, so be it. I had to take less somewhere else. So I think the Giants are still going to be in the same spot where like Saquon not only wants value, but he wants like symbolic value, right? So is Joe Schoen and the Giants willing to go to the $10 million plus kind of range because of what he meant? Maybe it's a 3-year deal, guaranteed money at X, very similar to last year in the offers that were discussed. My big high level, and we can use this as the transition to Daniel Jones here briefly, is I think that Joe Schoen also made a massive mistake a year ago, as most people would, I think, agree. You should have tagged Daniel Jones. You should have signed a 3-year deal for Saquon Barkley, and you should have been reassessing things the other way around, as opposed to now where we talk about will Daniel Jones be ready for next season under center?
Yeah, I mean, it does look a little bit hindsight in obviously when you look at what happened with Daniel Jones, where not only did he look like he regressed on the field, but then also got injured. And Saquon Barkley was relatively healthy, missed obviously a couple games with his leg injury, but played hard for the team and is a guy that everyone admittedly wants back around. It's tough on him. What I did want to just quickly pivot to before we talk about Daniel Jones is one of the other things he talked about was Xavier McKinney, who over the last 6 games, Adam, was like a world beater. He was like one of the best players on the Giants over the last 5, 6, 7 games. And it's interesting that it coincidentally happens in the last 6 games before he potentially hits free agency. And,
really rounded into form there, just at the right time. Wow, lucky me. Lucky me.
I mean, it's just fortunate that the circumstances unfolded the way that they did at that exact moment. And, some people may call me cynical for saying that, but, 2 interceptions in his last game. He looked like he was all over the field again. They asked Joe Schoen about what they thought about Xavier McKinney. He used the same exact terminology that he did with Saquon Barkley last year, said, not going to negotiate against myself by calling him elite or all world or all pro. He is part, we like Xavier McKinney. We would like to have him back, but there are also larger considerations on how we construct this roster accordingly. And so, I mean, quick thought, quick analysis. Do you think he's going to be back? Do you want him back? Do you want him to be franchised if they don't use it on Saquon? And what's the number on a long-term deal you go to for someone like Xavier McKinney?
Yeah, can't franchise tag him because the number is too high at the safety position. And the Giants, they don't know exactly. Joe Schoen also said in the press conference, doesn't know exactly what the cap number is going to be, but they're going to be around 40 million. And by the way, even on 12.5 tag for Saquon Barkley, it's like, oh, we have 40 million in cap room. Well, now you have, 28 million in cap room after you tag Saquon Barkley. So there's concerns in that area as well. Numbers too high to me at the safety position to tag him. Yes, I would have Xavier McKinney back, and that's a really positive reflection on how his season went, right? Both he and Bobby Okereke got game balls from Brian Daboll after this one for playing every single snap this season. That matters. Stability matters. We talk about injuries for this team, but it still comes down to the numbers game, right? I will say I think that Xavier McKinney as a young player did go through an evolution in the way that he communicated and talked in post games with the media to where he ended up at the end of the year. I'm more than willing. Like, I don't think it has to be black and white, his attitude, he just starts to get cooking at the right time of year. I think you can look at him as a guy that has rounded himself maybe into form, that has rounded himself quite well into form underneath Wink Martindale. The difference here is Pinnock, who went down with injury, obviously, he's around, and then Dane Belton, who got reps on Sunday too. So the Giants have options here. I do wonder if it's kind of similar to Saquon. Go to market. Let me know what the market says, and we're happy to be in those waters. But I can't go to tag on Xavier McKinney this offseason.
17 million plus for Xavier McKinney on the franchise tag. And the thing about that, Adam, and this is why longer term deals are always more important for GMs, is that locks the number in terms of cap space. Like, you can't manipulate that number to be able to push dead money down the road or put some of it out as a signing bonus. That's 17 million that hits the cap. And you mentioned if the Giants are sitting at 40 million, you'd be putting 17 million directly against Xavier McKinney. You'd only have 23 million then to operate with. You still have to sign Saquon Barkley. You still have to figure out the quarterback situation. How much money does that give you for your offensive line? There's a whole host of things that go into that, where I think you're right. I just don't think it's possible to tag Xavier. But at the same time, he's going to want 15 million annually over 4 years. Like, that's at minimum. Like, he's going to be probably asking for 20 million per year over 4 years. I just don't know if the Giants can allocate that money, even though Xavier McKinney played extremely well for this Giants defense. There are so many other holes, and it's like, can you get 70 cents on the dollar with Dane Belton and Jason Pinnock? Like, the allocation of funds is going to be fascinating for me.
Yeah, and we know how contracts can be constructed, right? It's just like with Daniel Jones, the number was underneath 20 million this year, closer to 15 million this year, then it balloons next season. So you can manipulate it maybe in a way where you feel like, well, depending on when those hits come, then the Xavier McKinney value is there in the short term, and it still gives us flexibility. So there are the options, but you mentioned some guys inside the room right now you could look at and say, hey, if we can get pretty close to value, or even more importantly, if we can add value to the defense in other areas through free agency with the money that we don't spend on Xavier McKinney, that could be a big factor too. So those are obviously two of the high-level guys that we talk about, Saquon Barkley, Xavier McKinney, each on one side of the ball here. The quick, I'll say almost quick footnote, because we'll talk about this in the offseason. There's not a glaring, update around Daniel Jones. But Mike Garafolo yesterday said the expectations is that Daniel Jones will be the week 1 starter for the New York Football Giants in 2024. Joe Schoen, when discussing it, said, yeah, we're going to continue to address the QB room, obviously. Like, one way or the other, we're going to have to talk about it. And that's fine. But he also mentioned, and I will say about Tyrod Taylor, that, we'll see. Like, I wouldn't write off him being back a part of this team as well. So 2 things. One, the Giants fell 1 spot in the draft to 6. Doesn't dramatically change how they would approach things if they want to move up or otherwise, or they want to stand pat, or they want to trade down. It may actually change a little bit if they wanted to trade down, because there'll be 1 less good player on the board for a team to come get. the idea that the way that Joe Schoen addresses it is fine. Like, hey, we don't know. It could be anybody. It could still be Daniel Jones. But I do find it interesting that they are leaving this open. And we've kind of talked about this a couple of times here. I don't think it's a lock that the Giants are taking a quarterback in the draft. I think that fans convince themselves that trading up and getting one of those guys or having one of them fall to you, that guarantee lock was going to be the move. I don't think it's the case. And I also no longer think it's the case that it's a foregone conclusion that Tyrod Taylor isn't back with this team. Because if you go and look at the QB landscape, he's among the best free agent QB options to have a veteran backup for an injured Daniel Jones potentially. I'm not saying right, wrong, good, bad, indifferent, but Tyrod Taylor certainly, though he has struggled staying healthy, showed you that he can run this offense. He can be a quality QB for you for what he is at this stage of his career.
Oh, Adam, it's tough. This is the part that makes me frustrated because of a few things. One, people talk about Daniel Jones. He has his injury issues outside of the poor play that he showed on the field. Obviously, that is a huge concern that he's obviously been dinged up multiple times with neck injuries, now the ACL. You talk about Tyrod Taylor.
Yes, sir.
It is my preference that we move on from Tyrod Taylor and we find a different veteran backup. And it's not because the play wasn't adequate on the field. It's not because he's not a good locker room guy or like anything like that. It's more like we have these injury concerns and injury issues with Daniel Jones. Tyrod Taylor, every game feels like he's like one snap away from being injured and out for 4 games again. Yeah. And that is a huge concern for me. Obviously, he had the rib injury earlier this year. He's had a litany of injuries in his career where he misses 4, 3, 5, 6 games at a time. And you just want a backup that can sit there and right the ship and make sure that he's going to be reliable. And so when you have Daniel Jones, that's often injured, and then you bring back Tyrod Taylor, who's often injured.
That's right.
And then you have Giant fans saying, let's take Michael Penix with the 6th pick, who has 2 ACLs and a shoulder reconstruction. Like how much
Week 3, who's our 4th quarterback? Tommy DeVito, come on down.
How much more fragility do you want in the quarterback room at that point? I feel like if we're going to change this up, it's not about Tyrod Taylor's play. It's about getting like a consistent, healthy, stable, structured guy behind Daniel Jones, even if you do go in the draft and take a quarterback.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. Like, I think that's a big factor inside of all of this. And we will talk about that more as we work our way through the offseason. So we'll circle back up with that, but it is just interesting. At least at this point, Joe Schoen and the Giants at least open to the idea of more of the same next year inside of their QB room, though obviously no firm commitments were made. The other area that we get back to here, we talked about at the top, looks like Wink Martindale and Mike Kafka are going to be here. Maybe something changes. Maybe, again, I think with Wink Martindale, it's a head coaching opportunity potentially. I don't know. Most of the playoff teams in the NFL right now are run by offensive-minded head coaches, so hard to convince yourself if you're an organization that that's the right route. There were, however, changes made and changes that we expected. Thomas McGahee and Bobby Johnson. Let's start with Thomas McGahee here first, because he's been a long-tenured member of the Giants. He's run the special teams, and he feels like an example of someone whose maybe time has just run out, because he was very good. The special teams were a strength for a few years, and then they started to go the wrong direction. And then it became, well, they can never find consistency. When you think about his time and the Giants and the personnel that they used on special teams, do you think that this is as much about changing it up and going in a new direction and a fresh set of eyes as it is about the performance? Because I can make a case that the Giants organizationally have done a horrible job with punt returners, with even, the punting and kicking department has been a mess at times. Like, it's not just on the coordinator here. I don't think there's as much ire about Thomas McGahee as there will be when we discuss Bobby Johnson.
It's interesting because Thomas McGahee, I think you mentioned it and you summed it up pretty perfectly. I think the wave just came to shore. Like, sometimes it's not about a coach being a poor coach or not knowing what he's doing. It's just the partnership and the relationship needs a new, fresh set of eyes. It needs someone else controlling it. Because if you think about it, do you remember the name Aldrick Rosas, Adam?
Oh, dude, that was a killer.
He was basically I think he was a second team All-Pro in 2018 for the Giants. Then the Giants kind of let him go after he had those concerns, and they just happened to stumble into Graham Gano, who ends up making the Pro Bowl and is like the most consistent kicker before he got hurt this year. And when you have those kickers that just step up and they end up performing really well, it masks a lot of other issues on special teams. We talked about punt returns. We talked about kickoff returns. Special teams the last 2 years has been pretty poor. And it felt like Brian Daboll was like, hey, I'm making all these other changes. Thomas McGahee's been in the building. Why don't we just give people some consistency and we'll keep him here? Didn't feel like they actually did a true evaluation. And,
right. I got enough stuff going on. Just keep Thomas McGahee.
Well, Bobby Skinner from Talking Giants was mentioning it this morning. It's been mentioned like in the interview with Thomas McGahee that Brian Daboll did. Like halfway through, he's like, you know what? Like I got too much stuff going on. Do you want the job or not? Like, do you want to just keep your same like office and same locker? And he's like, yeah, sure. It's like it feels like that was a little bit of an afterthought for the Giants. I mean, special teams just has not been good enough for the Giants. It really hasn't, and it's time for a change, Adam. It really is. The one thing I will say before we flip it over to our other friend, Bobby Johnson, is the decision-making. We talk about letting Jamison Crowder go prior to the season, even though he was going to be our functional punt returner, kick returner, and looked awesome doing it for the Washington Commanders. A lot of that was on Joe Schoen making these critical decisions. Then they decide to put Eric Gray out there, who's never caught a punt or a kick in a game in his life, and was like, I guess I'll try this out. Sure. And obviously he started fumbling the ball. Then he got himself injured doing something that he never does. Yep. At one point, it's on Joe Schoen because he's putting the personnel together. But at another point, Thomas McGahee has to look and be like, I'm not comfortable putting my name and my reputation on the line for this guy to be returning kicks when he's never done it before in his life. Like, accountability works in a whole host of ways. It's not just on Joe Schoen roster construction, right?
No, 100%. And you know, as we're doing our live over on YouTube here, and we see Charlie K mentioning, hey, does Thomas McGahee have a say in those things, in personnel decisions, right? What is his input and involvement there? I'm sure it is something, right? I'm sure there is something that he provides his insight around what he thinks. As Charles K mentioned, don't forget Adoree Jackson returning punts, then getting hurt. My stance on this would be is like, yes, does he have an opinion? Sure. Do I think that Thomas McGahee said, hey, don't worry about it, I'll use Adoree Jackson? No chance in heck that he was saying that's what he wanted to do. And oh, by the way, you know, I thought about this yesterday because I was watching it with Doug Norrie, co-host of the Locked On Nets podcast. Go check that out. We were watching the game, and I was having a hilarious time when Doug brought up he could not compute seeing Randy Bullock on the sidelines, watching him turn back profile and going, what am I looking at? We know who Randy Bullock is, but this guy looked like a refrigerator cube on sticks. And you can tell, you know, Mason Crosby, a veteran player, blah, blah, blah. Once you have your kicker go down in Gano, the Giants didn't why not go with any number of young kickers? There are thousands of these guys walking around the street. Some are good, some are terrible. NFL teams go through this all the time. And you realize the cream of the crop of kickers versus everything else. But they went with old, veteran guys. Randy Bullock, who went out and kicked a field goal and immediately blew his hamstring apart. It's decision-making matters here. And ultimately, when it comes to Thomas McGahee, I'm fine to move on with him because that represents the, hey, stability matters. Let's keep the guy around that's been here. Let's keep him here. He has familiarity, by the way, with a lot of back-end roster guys that are going to be a part of that unit. The flip side of this, though, is Bobby Johnson. Now, this is where you go, mistakes made, I think. He has ties to Brian Daboll. You bring him in. Let's just acknowledge it. He was not good enough. He was not the right coach for this job. And I think letting him go, as Brian Daboll said in the press conference, the development just wasn't good enough. It was not there. Okay, I'm glad that you moved on. My question tied to him is, why not do this during the year at some point? Like, you know, the injuries kind of get this really nice bit of wiggle room for the Giants overall to say, well, because of this, and oh, if not only for that, and Daniel Jones going down, all that stuff. Okay, great. But if you believe you might have a guy in-house and maybe it's easy to do it in the offseason and that's all well and good, why not try to see if you can course correct with especially some of these young players' development, like an Evan Neal, pre-injuries at the end of the year? Why not try to make that move sooner? Instead, you ride this ship all the way to the bottom. It has a sentiment of like the Giants waved the white flag on this year and just said, yep, see you in the offseason. We'll make our decisions then.
Okay. I have a lot to say on this topic, and I might go all over the place on this.
All right.
But this has been a problem for the Giants for quite a while now. We know the offensive line is a challenge. Adam, I really bucket it into three different areas. You have injuries, player evaluation, and coaching, right? Like the injuries can zap you of things. If the evaluation from the front office isn't good, then it is what it is. And then you have the coaching aspect, how we coach people up. With that said, let's look at the Giants in a vacuum. Adam, do you know how many sacks the Giants gave up this season?
I don't know how many they gave up yesterday, but I'm going to go with like 89.
They gave up 85 sacks.
Oh, good. They only gave up 2 yesterday. What a clean day. What a clean day for the offensive line.
Unbelievable. And you know what 85 sacks represents? The second most all time in a single season is what they gave up. And you could say, well, it's on the quarterback. It's like, which quarterback? We had 3 of them back there. Like, we've had multiple guys trying to do things, and it did not work. Adam, I've got another question for you.
Oh, all right.
The best team in the league, or the 2 teams tied for the least amount of sacks, was the Rams and the 49ers. Mm-hmm. How many more sacks do you think the Giants gave up this season than both the Rams and the 49ers?
Combined, the 2 of them, or individually?
Individually, just whatever their each individual
I would
team.
say they gave up probably close to 40 more.
51 more sacks. They gave up
shot.
51 more sacks than the 49ers and the Rams, respectively. Adam, think about this. There's only 5 teams outside the Giants in the NFL that gave up more than 50 sacks in the entire season.
Respect.
So the Giants are that far away. This isn't a small matter. This isn't, well, a little bit of a tweak here. It is broken completely. Whether it is the injury concerns, we have to figure out how to get everybody healthy, because Evan Neal went down. John Michael Schmitz went down. Tyree Phillips went down. Andrew Thomas went down. Everybody went down. Then you have the player evaluation. Is Evan Neal going to be a guy that is here long-term? Joshua Zudu, we spent picks on him. Marcus McKeithen, we spent picks on him. What is going on? John Michael Schmitz looked like he regressed. What is going on there? Then you have the coaching aspect. If these guys are all high picks like Evan Neal was, and everyone said he was a can't-miss prospect, how did we miss? How did we miss so badly that he's not even a serviceable? It's not even that he's like not reaching his expectations. It's he's a liability on the field. And so for me, this whole thing with Bobby Johnson, I agree with you wholeheartedly. It was like they saw the crash about to happen and they just let it happen, as opposed to being like, we got to try something else or else the season's going to go awry. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Why are we waiting till the end of the year when this was a problem early on that basically made Daniel Jones gun shy and really made the offense, not be able to function as a unit?
And Joseph Clark over on the live, that's not like 5 sacks a game. It is 5 sacks a game. That's the average sacks per game given up on the year for the New York Football Giants. One note on this, as we like to do inside that QB room, if you want to talk about the numbers specifically, and the offensive line had good and bad runs throughout the season. And I use the term good, very loosely here when we talk about it. But 160 pass attempts for Daniel Jones. He was sacked 30 times on the year. 178 for Tommy DeVito. Sacked 37 times on the season, 180, the most pass attempts of any QB this season for the New York Football Giants for Tyrod Taylor, sacked 17 times. The mobility matters. Now, do you want the offensive line play to be better? Of course you do. But sometimes you got to try to manufacture your way to some success. So a lot of sacks given up, and noting the 37 against Tommy DeVito, I think is kind of a big number, just to mention where this ended up. Could it have looked a little less egregious? Sure. Could have been 70 sacks. It still would have been insane. And the Giants have a big area to clean up there. That is not only some of the key players that are going to be this offseason decision-making, not only the coaches that are at least going to be back in the short term, we think, and the coaches that are being let go. Then there was the football game itself and the cap off of this 2023-2024 season. I do just want to, and we're going to do more of this as we move forward here, and there'll be more. There's so much more out of this press conference, so we're going to have multiple episodes this week breaking down different areas of it, including my thoughts around one Darren Waller. We'll get to that later on, so be sure to be tuned in for it. The high-level takeaways are a couple of nice things happened on Sunday for the New York Football Giants. We talked about it in the pregame, some bonus incentives for one Darius Slayton. Guess what? He got there. He got his 5 catches. He had the big bomb touchdown grab. This was to me, a really nice cap of the season for Darius Slayton, who played in all 17 games this year. It's just 50, but that was the benchmark, getting to 50. Had a career high 770 yards. And for the first time since his rookie year, where he had 8 touchdowns, he had 4 touchdowns on this campaign and had 15.4 yards per reception. This was a really nice game for him, and it also got him some extra coin in his pocket. We talk about him. We also talked about Jihad Ward. He got the sack that he needed to get some incentives there too. Just on a high level, checking some of those boxes for these kind of guys before I think we spotlight a second-round wide receiver pick that looks like he's ready to take the next big step in 2024.
Is that second-round wide receiver Sterling Shepard? Is that who you're mentioning?
He's ready to take a big step, and it's a big step into the next phase of his career, which we all know it was nice moments. They let him come out, disgusted by any of the Giants fans on Twitter who for some reason took issue with giving him a special moment. He moved into 5th position all time in receptions in franchise history. Whatever you think he was or was not, he's one of the longest tenured Giants, like in recent memory, that lasted 5-6 years with the organization. Yes, he had injuries, but he carried himself the right way. He got a game ball after in the locker room. Like, he's a well-respected Giant. Good day for him as well.
Don't you want to celebrate your own players so that other people look and they're like, wow, they take care of people that are loyal to them. This game was meaningless for the Giants in the grand scheme of things. So like, it's not like this was do or die for the playoffs. And they're like, let's force feed Sterling Shepard 1,000 receptions in spite of us wanting to make the playoffs. The Giants did it right. It was one of the reasons why my favorite wager going into this game was Sterling Shepard to score a touchdown at 10-1. He got 5 targets, which was the most that he had basically all season. And they targeted him. The second they got in the red zone on that Tyrod Taylor interception, they said they practiced it all week. They were going to Sterling Shepard on that play. He also, they tried to get him involved. They put him, he caught a couple balls inside the 5-yard line. They were really trying their hardest to get him a touchdown at him. Yeah. It's just good to see that the Giants not only played well on defense, but the offense looked to be moving the ball. Tyrod was moving the ball effectively. Saquon Barkley had 2 touchdowns in what could be his last game. They tried to get the ball to Sterling Shepard. And you mentioned it. Wan'Dale Robinson, who's part of the longer-term vision for this team, looked good. They were getting him the ball in space, and he was making explosive plays happen.
Listen, man, you go back and you look at him over the last 6 games, really, of this season. 5, 7, 4, 7, 9, and 6 targets per game, catching 5, 6, 3, 4, 6, 4 catches per game. Some of the yardage was lower. They had a couple like 25. You had 3 catches a few weeks ago for just 16 yards. But these last 2 weeks alone, really, a combined 11 receptions on 15 targets, cleared 130 yards, had a touchdown going back to the game against the Rams. And you started to see that combination. The one that really stood out to me was that crossing route that got him down to about the 5-yard line, down the left sideline there from Tyrod Taylor, gets bumped out. He also gets bumped out going down the right sideline. Yes, again, second time we'll reference Doug Norrie. He played him in fantasy. It did not pan out. Ended up giving up touchdowns instead of getting receiving touchdowns for him, rushing touchdowns for Saquon. But this is really important. 60 catches on the year for Wan'Dale.
Well, it looks like Adam was just mentioning 60 catches for Wan'Dale Robinson. Obviously, if you get Adam, you said 60 receptions for Wan'Dale Robinson. I think Charles in the chat just bringing up great points. It's like if you were to position a number 1 wide receiver alongside someone like Wan'Dale Robinson and the production you get from Darius Slayton, it makes the wide receiver room look considerably different next year.
Yes, and the 60 catches on 78 targets, by the way, right? So high volume in terms of converting those. He led the team. Darren Waller had 52 receptions and had a lot of injuries this year. Darius Slayton was 3rd. Saquon Barkley was 4th. Daniel Bellinger was 5th, by the way, ahead of Jalen Hyatt, who had an injury in this one with the hamstring. Wasn't quite able to maybe put together a game that we could have got excited about for him as well. But yeah, Wan'Dale Robinson has come into his own. And if you think about adding a player through the draft, creating a little bit of a hierarchy there in that room, all of a sudden these guys could really flourish. So there were real positives here, including just on a high level. You beat the Philadelphia Eagles, and you can say, we know by the second half of this game, it's all kind of wrapped up and it doesn't matter in terms of what happened with the Commanders and the Cowboys game. But at the start of this game, it mattered. The first half of this game mattered, and the Giants absolutely handled their business against the Eagles team that frankly has been laboring the last month of the season. But these last few games, if we want to tie a bow on it in that way, the Giants, do you think that these last few weeks can be an indication of not if not for injuries, but just this team probably, in my opinion, was never more than an 8 or 9 win team this year. That's what we said. I said coming in, I said their floor was 7 and their ceiling was 9. I came up a little bit short. I don't think the ceiling was any higher, even if you think about health being a part of this. But maybe they deserve to be a 7-win team this year based on a couple of little moments and a couple of little plays. The last few weeks were a nice indication that this team can have success, that the defense can play at a high level, that the offense can play complementary football, and that some of your skill positions are ready to take that next step.
when Daniel Jones went down against the Las Vegas Raiders, it felt like the low point in the season. Things were abysmal. Everyone was talking about tanking to get the number one overall pick or the number 2 overall pick. And you and I both came on here and said the Giants have too many pieces and are held together too well to just completely lose out the rest of the games. And you saw the fight. You saw the commitment to each other that they had. The defense played hard for Wink Martindale. Tyrod Taylor was still throwing the ball around. They could have easily won that game against the Rams. If Crosby doesn't miss a kick at the end of the game. Like the Giants showed fight over the course of the season. It shows that there are pieces here. It is not as bad as it is in Carolina, right? Where there's they don't have their first round pick. They're devoid of talent all over the place. They definitely don't know if they have their quarterback. They directionally, they don't know where they're going. It's not as bad as it is in New England right now, where they don't know what their quarterback situation is. They have no explosive talent on offense at all. There are worse situations to be in than the Giants are. There are flashes. They showed flashes. They showed heart, competitiveness. These are all things that Brian Daboll can kind of hang on to as he thinks about what the shape of this roster will be next season. But yeah, the 6th pick in the draft, you win a game, you bury the Eagles. It doesn't impact the draft status as much as it potentially could have. It felt like overall it was a pretty good day all around, Adam.
Yeah, at the end of it, the Giants finished 6-11. They dropped the 1 spot, as we say in the Tankathon. The LA Chargers get up there into the 5th position here. We know, listen, there's kind of this tier, it feels like, of 3 quarterbacks, and then who falls behind them. There's a couple of wide receivers at the top of this draft class. There's offensive linemen at the top of this draft class. The Giants are going to have decisions to make, and they're going to have flexibility around those decisions. I do think it matters, as we said, with some of the turmoil around the coaching staff. Well, what does it tell you about Brian Daboll? The one thing I'll say here, and we'll discuss this going forward, is like his tone was interesting from the last couple of weeks to then the end of this game, and to the way that he talked in the locker room. And his message to the locker room was, "Hey, we didn't quite get where we wanted to, but great foundational moves, right? We did a lot of things well." But it had this very jovial, almost upbeat tone, and I'm not judging that. I just find it interesting relative to the way that he talked and addressed the press over the last few games of the season leading up to it. So I think Brian Daboll is trying to turn that corner going to the offseason. I think key players are going to, but guess what? 31, whether injuries, IR, all this kind of stuff, 31 players have expiring contracts for the New York Football Giants. This thing is going to look different. Some of them are going to retire. Some of them are going to move on for money reasons. And some of them are going to be let go of because this Giants team still needs to continue to improve. So there's a lot. There is a lot that is going to happen over this offseason. It at least feels like, especially at home, that's a nice moment. You beat your division rival. It's one of those things. Why is the NFL built so well? Because even a team like the Giants, who had nothing to play for yesterday, and the Eagles had everything to accomplish potentially at the start of the day, you still end up getting a great game, right? You still get these gritty, tough performances. And that's what makes the NFL the best sport probably right now in the world today, right? It's just everything matters. Everything's intense. And even for this Giants team, hopefully you feel like you got them going in the right direction here.
At the end of the day, Adam, you already saw the coaching carousel has started. Ron Rivera was already announced let go of the Washington Commanders. They're going through a full rebuild. Arthur Smith was let go last night. I don't think they even let him pack up his stuff at the team facility. There are going to be more and more changes, like things in Chicago with Matt Eberflus and other places. There will be more coaching updates with coordinators coming and going, potentially for the New York Giants over the next few days. Keep an eye out on which coaches get released, in different spots that may have connections to someone like Brian Daboll on both the offensive and the defensive side of the ball. Because as I said, I'm not convinced yet that the dust has settled on what this coaching staff is going to look like next season for the Giants.
Also, as we failed to mention inside of this here, running backs coach is in fact going to Syracuse to take over the head coaching job there as well. So we have some, there are going to be some changes here. Maybe QB coach could get elevated if Mike Kafka is moved on from. So there's things like that we can discuss. And it's a good point from Andy. Hey, as firings happen, maybe it influences how you think about your coordinators on this staff. And if it is Brian Daboll or Joe Schoen going to John Marin pushing for a change or a shift, if I can point to Coach X coming off of Team Y and say, we believe that this will be the shift for us going into this upcoming season, then you certainly want to have that discussion. Bottom line is, guys, whether it's Charles K, whether it's John Martin, I wish your name was John Mara, but that's okay. Joseph Clark, frequent flyer for us, and then obviously kicking things off here with Brian Grant, who was here from the very top of it. We appreciate you coming in on the live here on a Monday morning, Black Monday, unfortunately, for a handful of coaches on the Giants, and then around the league as well. All week long this week, it's going to be a ton of this. There were so many comments coming out of this press conference, a lot more of a conversation to have around Daniel Jones in the QB room here. So be sure to be over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast, over on Twitter at One Giant Podcast, at AndyMac214, at Adam Armbrecht as well, and on the podcast wherever you get those needs fulfilled. Until next time, until next season, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.